Our scripture this morning is from the book of Acts. I'm going to be reading from the Contemporary English Version. I invite you to be looking at your own favorite version of this passage and see how it compares. It's Acts 14, beginning with Acts 17, beginning with the 22nd verse. Acts 17:22. So Paul stood up in front of the council and said, "People of Athens, I see that you are very religious. As I was going through your city and looking at the things you worship, I found an altar with the words, 'To an unknown God.' You worship this God, but you don't really know him. So I want to tell you about him. This God made the world and everything in it. He is Lord of heaven and earth, and he doesn't live in temples built by human hands. He doesn't need help from anyone. He gives life, breath, and everything else to all people. From one person, God made all nations who live on earth, and he decided when and where every nation would be. God has done all this so that we will look for him and reach out and find him. He isn't far from any of us. And he gives us the power to live, to move, and to be who we are. We are his children, just as some of your poets have said. Since we are God's children, we must not think that he is like an idol made out of gold or silver or stone. He isn't like anything that humans have thought up and made. In the past, God forgave all this because people did not know what they were doing. But now he says that everyone, everywhere, must turn to him. He has set a day when he will judge the world's people with fairness. And he has chosen the man Jesus to do the judging for him. God has given proof of this to all of us by raising Jesus from death.
All right, since we're all wondering whose kid it was said that their dad doesn't have any manners, let's just assume that all the kids said that. And it's a reminder for all the dads to pick it up a little bit. Because I know you're wondering. Let's just put that aside. Assume it was for all the dads. So some of us in our house this morning were awakened to the soft but persistent pitter-patter of moths at our windows. Anyone else wake up to that, or at least know that sound in the last week? Some of us were awakened to our neighbor mowing at 7:30. And it was a reminder that this particular neighbor is not part of a faith community and doesn't have a Sunday morning routine with a church family. And I wonder and have wondered about his faith and the family's faith. And in 9 years, we've never talked about anything deeper than weather or our dogs or perhaps where it is that we like to vacation. And that bothers me. If they are not part of a faith family, a faith community, when do conversations about faith happen in their lives? I guess that could be me. I guess I could be Esther saying, for such a time or such a place, maybe this is why I'm here. But I don't know how to do that. And isn't that the biggest irony of all? I'm a professional at talking about faith. And I don't know how to do it outside of these walls or outside of this particular faith community. I also look around in our culture and I notice people with seemingly very different values than mine, and I cannot for the life of me understand where they're coming from. I can't for the life of me get to the same conclusions that they've gotten to about life and what's important and who should be in charge. And I happened upon this passage in Acts, which is the one that's chosen for today out of the lectionary. So if you don't know, the lectionary is essentially a collection of Bible passages for the entire year that are given. Each Sunday has a selection of passages, and church committees have worked on this sort of ecumenical. Lots of different churches have worked on these passages. There's different kinds of lectionaries, but essentially it's like assigned readings that have Old Testament and a psalm and a gospel, and then like a letter or something else from the New Testament. And so we use them sometimes. Oftentimes we use them like in the Lent season or in the Advent season. And sometimes we use them when we just don't know exactly what we're doing from week to week, if we don't have another series planned or something like that. So I opened to these selection of passages and found this Acts passage for today, and it struck a chord in part because of my experience of sort of living in my neighborhood and living in this broader culture around me and the questions that are raised. And this is one of the more interesting stories in the book of Acts in particular, because the book of Acts is the Acts of the apostles. Some call it the Acts of the Holy Spirit, because it tells the story of the early Jesus people going out and telling people about Jesus and showing people about Jesus. And most of the time when they do this, Peter or Paul are sort of the main ones that we read about. They usually start by going into a new city and finding the local Jewish gathering, the local Jewish synagogue. Because the story of Jesus, as even Matthew tells in his genealogy, goes the whole way back to Abraham. This is the story of God's people. And Jesus is the fulfillment of the Messiah. So they would often go into the Jewish centers because the Jewish people would have the background knowledge of the law and the prophets, of the promise of Abraham to bless a family and then thereby bless the whole world through that family. So the strategy or the idea was that they would go to the place where people kind of knew the background and then could understand then the fulfillment. And then once they went into the Jewish synagogue, then they might go out into the streets and they might tell people about Jesus other places. But the foundation, the starting point was always in the Jewish center of town. And this is a particular fascinating story because this is not the way it works in this particular story. Paul finds himself in Athens. Athens at one point was sort of like the cultural and philosophical hub of the whole Greek Empire. And so Athens was the place where philosophy and pagan religion and all these kinds of things were at their center. It was an economic center. It was this great big hub. It had lessened a little bit since the Roman Empire had taken over, but it was still really sort of the epitome of the center of Greek culture and the diversity of Greek and Roman culture and life. And Paul finds himself here because he's been a couple different places, and his message and the message of his partners and the early Christians has been 50-50. Some people really like what he has to say. Some people feel really, really threatened. So there's actually quite a bit of antagonism and possibly even violence. There's arguing about this whole Jesus movement in a couple different cities. So Paul's buddies say, "Hey, you're kind of like the lightning rod for all of this stuff. So why don't you go down towards the coast and hang out for a little bit, and maybe things will cool off a little bit because you're sort of the instigator of all this." So they leave him alone and send him to this sort of the hub of Greek culture and life. And this is where Paul finds himself on his own in a place that doesn't seem to really have much of a Jewish presence that precedes him. This is where Paul is. So he's in Athens, and he's looking around, and he's noticing that there are idols and statues and altars to multiple gods all over the place. So he's walking through the city. He's just biding his time, again, until his missionary buddies come to get him. And he's looking around. He's walking through the streets, and he's seeing statues and altars and all these different idols to various gods. And as he's doing that, it's starting to bother him. And that lightning rod effect thing is starting to happen, and he's not able to keep his mouth shut as he's walking through. Even though this wasn't really even the place where they were supposed to go, he feels like he needs to say something. And so it bothers him to just be walking around and seeing all these idols and statues and altars. And I think, at least as I'm sort of imagining this in the background, imagining this as sort of what Paul's experiencing, I think, at least for me, I think we find ourselves in similar situations in our current day. If we slow down a bit and take a time to look around, I think we might notice idols in our own cultures. And we might not think of them as idols, because I don't know that we really even use that term outside of, singing competitions on TV. Idols is just not a term that we're familiar with. We don't really use it. But I think if we think about the things in our cultures around us that we are a part of that draw a lot of our attention and our time and our money and our desire, I think we might be able to highlight, at least for some of us, what these idols might be. So for some of us, these might be idols that we see in relation to our obsession with sports. This might be our loyalty to a particular political party or even a news personality. We have created idols. We have created idols of our cell phones. We have created idols of our country. We've created idols of ourselves, because ultimately the most important person, the person who has that we are most accountable to, is ourself. I think we can even create idols out of our religion. As sad as that is, I think that's true, because I think we can wear crosses, we can go to church, we can call ourselves Christian without ever truly receiving or sharing the love of Jesus. And that our identity as Christian is important to us, maybe even more so than really trying to submit ourselves to the love of Jesus and to share that with others. So we might look around, we might be like Paul, we might take the time to kind of walk through our own lives and the lives of the cultures around us, and we might see idols of individualism and politicism and nationalism. And like Paul, we can get pretty frustrated or distressed or sad or angry. And so how do we respond? What are we to do? I think this feels like a very important moment in Paul's journey, and perhaps even in ours. And believe it or not, Paul doesn't actually go and find just the right sarcastic meme that he can put on Facebook or Twitter. He doesn't do that. Isn't that shocking? Paul goes and meets with real people, and he engages in discussions. My translation says that he went about the city and he argued, but we have to remember that in the context of ancient culture, in the context of Athens, argue is not being argumentative. Argue is the way in which ideas were shared in that culture at that time. Debate, honestly listening to someone else's perspective, sharing your own. Okay, so if we see the word argue, we should understand it not as an attack, but as a genuine back and forth. Paul was debating. It was the healthy debate in which people were honestly sharing their perspectives and their ideas. So Paul took the time to actually listen to other people, and then also to offer his own perspective. And then, in a portion of our text today, we see a crucial part of this activity that he's engaged in, this evangelism, if you will. Paul found something to appreciate about the culture around him. So he noticed that they were very religious. And he names that as a statement of fact, possibly as an encouragement. He says, you all are very religious. You are committed. You recognize that there is a higher power beyond you, or higher powers in their particular case. And he points out this altar that has been built to, quote, an unknown God. Most of the gods had names. The people in Athens had created this other altar, perhaps because they wanted to make sure that they weren't missing anybody. So to an unknown God was their way of saying, like, to any God that we may have missed. Because they were religious, because they wanted to make sure that they were on the right side of those in charge. And so Paul uses this opportunity to share his conviction that he has met and knows this unknown God, this God that was revealed as the creator and heaven of earth, the Lord of everything, the one who raised Jesus Christ from the dead. So he recognizes and appreciates what they have inside of them, this longing to be on one with or on the right side of the powers above. And he says, this unknown God I know too. And I know this God as Yahweh the Lord, the God of heaven and earth, the one who has raised Jesus Christ from the dead. And then he goes on to continue this sort of connecting to the people where they're at by quoting a pagan poet to name a truth about God. So if you find the line in verse 28, Acts 17:28, it says, "For in him we live and move and have our being." It's a beautiful, beautiful statement of truth about the God of the universe. In him we live and move and have our being. Paul was not the originator of that line. That was a pagan poet that had said that line the first time. And Paul found in a pagan, non-Jewish, non-Christian poet, found that poet had found a truth about God that he could affirm. There was a truth, a beauty, a presence of God in that one simple poetic line from a pagan poet that lived before Paul that the people had known and had been quoting. And then Paul goes on to encourage the people to recognize that the God that's been revealed through Jesus is not actually limited to the man-made idols and altars. That God is bigger than their sculptures and their altars and whatever human conception they would have of the gods. This God revealed in Jesus is bigger than all of that. This God is fully revealed in a person, an actual flesh and blood person, Jesus Christ. And that when Jesus comes again, God will judge the world not by its religiousness, by its religiosity, by the world's commitment to the religions, but by how people have been following and living out faith in Jesus Christ, the person who embodies God. So this is Paul's way of doing things, and I just find it fascinating to read the story, especially in the midst of our culture today, that when Paul is disturbed by much of the culture in which he finds himself, he does not spend his time railing against all that he sees that's wrong. Instead, he finds the things he can affirm that are consistent with who God is. And he finds the common ground of humanity within their cultural practices. He notices that they're religious. They want to connect with the divine. They want to live their lives in alignment with the ultimate truth. And he affirms this, and he sees it as something that so many of us want deep down, even if we don't know how to talk about it. Deep down, we want to understand our lives with meaning. We want to make sense of the world and connect with that thing that we know is out just beyond our daily lives. something that's beyond, that's above, that's in and through. Deep down, we want to connect. We want to bring our lives in line with that thing that has to be out there, that is more beautiful and more holy than what the brokenness that we experience in our everyday lives. And so Paul sees this in the people in Athens, and he presents the divine that has been revealed to him and many others through the life and death and resurrection of Jesus. And he notices the truth that can be found even among the pagan religion and culture. The truth of God that breaks through, the truth of God, the God that is above all and through all and in all. That God peeks through even the most broken of people and cultures around us. And he names that and he points it out. I just think it's fascinating that Paul, the apostle, the preacher of the gospel, quotes a pagan poet to name a truth about God. When I was about 12 years old, my family was driving the 3 hours from Grandma and Grandpa King's house in northern Pennsylvania back towards our house in Lancaster when our car's engine died right along the highway. And so we are kind of stranded at night on a dark road with, maybe a house every couple miles or something. It's the area between, anywhere north of like Harrisburg is pretty remote. And so we're stranded there, not sure what to do. Dad says, okay, you guys stay here in the van. I am going to walk. This is before cell phones, if you can imagine that time. Before cell phones, in the dark, the mom and the three of us stay in the van, and he says, I'm going to walk that way and see if I can find anybody. And so we're sitting for about 25 minutes or so, wondering, if Dad's okay and what happened. And then we see these lights come up the road the other direction and then turn around, and a van pulls up behind us. And my dad pops out and he runs over and says, hey guys, grab what you can. This gentleman's going to take us to his house. We're going to go to his house, and he's going to hold on to it. He's going to keep us for as long as we need to hang out there until Grandpa Glick in Lancaster can come pick us up. I called him. He'll be on the way. It'll be a couple hours, so we'll have to hang out in their house for a little while. So we get in the van, and I was like 10, 12-ish. We pull into the driveway of this house, and the first thing I notice is that there's a little shack kind of like up against the edge of the woods. And in front of the shack is a 30-foot tall skull, a 30-foot high, like styrofoam maybe skull with glowing red eyes. And that's what I see when we pull in the driveway. The first thing I see is a 30-foot skull with glowing red eyes, and I can just make out it's twilight, it's dark, but I can just make out the sign underneath that says Dr. Tom's Leather, and it's got a picture of like a skeleton with a leather, like a leather jacket, sort of like doing a Fonz or something like that. And so we walk in, and we get invited up to Dr. Tom's house behind the skull. As we walk in, we first go into the leather shop, and we are walked through by Dr. Tom because he wanted to show us all about his leather. And so we saw the leather jackets, and we saw the chaps, and we saw the whips, and we saw the lingerie, all made out of leather. And he was telling us about how he always goes down to Bike Week, in Daytona, and that's like his big week when he sells a lot. He doesn't sell a lot here out of this shop, but he always travels and goes to biker weeks and that sort of thing. So between the skull and the glowing eyes and the leather and the whips, I've got a picture in my mind of the kind of person that is rescuing us. And, as a 10-year-old, I think I have a fairly strong sense of right and wrong, or like dark gray. And I feel like, I'm in a place where I can safely offer some judgment on what I think about this, person's lifestyle and their emphasis. And we get into the house, and there was a football game on at the time. So we sit and we watch some football. And as we're waiting for Grandpa to arrive, more and more of what Dr. Tom is saying about the football and some of the commercials, reveal quite a bit of not so subtle racism while we're sitting there, and we're trying to deal with Dr. Tom's racist jokes that are peering up in between the skull and the glowing eyes and the leather. And in this setting, I am wildly uncomfortable. I feel out of place. I can look around and certainly point to just about anything I want to. I can close my eyes, and point, and I'll find something objectionable or something that I can, fairly easily as a Christian condemn. And eventually, Grandpa Glick comes, and we pile into his car, and we say thank you to Dr. Tom for rescuing us from being stranded, and we drive home and eventually work things out to get our car back. But it took me a while, and noticing, maybe even connecting the dots with our passage with Paul, the scenario I found myself in which the goodness and selflessness of Jesus was peeking through a setting that I could have pretty much, again, condemned just about everything else going on. The goodness of God, the goodness of sacrifice, the goodness of caring for someone else peeked through. And I wouldn't have named it at that point that way. I don't know if my parents would have named it at that point in that way. But certainly now I can look back and highlight, I think, what Paul saw in the pagan poet, in the devotion to being religious, is this, the peeking through of the goodness of God, even amidst the ugliness around us. And so when we look at the culture around us, will we focus on all the things that we can condemn, or will we focus on the presence of the Holy One that peeks through? What would it take for us to practice that daily? I also wonder what would be different about our world if we actually took the time to listen to people, especially those people with which we disagree, and find common ground for our deepest desires. I was leading a small class of kids through the Sermon on the Mount back in Virginia, and we got to the part of Jesus' teaching about nonviolence, and an 8-year-old girl raised her hand and responded to this lesson about Jesus' teaching by stating clearly that her dad had taught her that if someone ever gets in her face or is physical with her, she should punch that person right in the face. And I just stammered, being the good Mennonite pacifist that I grew up as. And I didn't really come up with a better response, much more than, but Jesus says this. I didn't know what to say in that moment. I knew what Jesus said, but that's about it. I very much failed at connecting with the deeper desire that was evident in what she was saying and what her dad had taught her. I wonder if I could go back, what would have been different had I taken the time to listen and to be honest with her and her dad about our deepest desires for dignity and our desires for justice, and to recognize that punching someone in the face is a response in some ways to wanting to claim the dignity and the justice that all of us should be afforded. Maybe this isn't the best conversation with an 8-year-old, but hopefully I would find language that would suit for an 8-year-old to have that conversation. But I wonder what would be different if I was able to name that and to find that connecting point and to recognize that Jesus wants that too for every single person. The outcome might be different, and Jesus shows us how to get to an outcome of nonviolence, to an outcome of trusting our dignity and justice to Jesus and not needing to engage in force or violence to establish that. But I didn't take that time to do that. I just shoved Jesus back in the face without really listening and being connected to this girl and her family. So I wonder what would look different if we took the time to really get to know people and to find the common humanity within each of us. Can we take the time to get off of TV news and social media and have actual conversations with real people about our desires, about our hopes, about our fears? Can we seek out the God we know in Jesus Christ and share him with others as the true answer to those deepest desires? Will we notice that our individualism, our nationalism, our politicism, our phones, our sports, our houses, our stuff, they can all fulfill our desires temporarily. But they absolutely become our idols when we give too much of our time and our focus to them instead of to the Lord. Instead of engaging in a culture war, I pray that we would have the patience and trust to see Jesus in all things and to name it to the people around us. I saw this play in the baseball game a couple weeks ago. I don't know if you saw this, where like someone bunted and the ball rolled directly on the foul line, and the catcher had no idea where the ball was because it blended into the line. Did anyone else see this? The catcher had no idea, and it was like all the other players were like, it's right there in front of your toes, right? And the catcher, with where his vision was, could not see it because it blended in perfectly with the foul line. Are we willing to see and point out Jesus' presence, the presence of the good, the presence of the Almighty, the presence of love and compassion, the presence of the beautiful one in our culture, in people around us? Do we have the willingness or the determination or the guts to actually name that for other people who might not see it or might have a different angle or a different perspective? I pray that we would find the common ground of humanity in the real lives of people around us. I hope I can actually do this with my neighbors. I hope I can go deeper than weather and vacation. And I pray that all of us would turn to Jesus, the source of the true and beautiful life, not an idol that satisfies temporarily, but the one true source of the true and beautiful life. May we turn to that Jesus now and forevermore. Amen.